Well, hey guys, welcome back. So now we're going to talk about the election of 64. So you can see it's a quick turnaround for Johnson. He becomes president in November of 63, finishes out just the tail end of JFK's term, but by November 64, he's up for election again. But in the Civil Rights Act, the war on poverty, he's done some things. And so that's what kind of brings us to this election, which is I think sneakily one of the most important elections in our history. Some people are aware of it, don't understand how important it is. But anyway, so LBJ, pretty popular. He's increasingly very unpopular among Southern Democrats because they really don't like the Civil Rights Act and his support of civil rights, and they're going to be much less likely to support a lot of the programs in the war on poverty. But amongst many Democrats, even some moderate Republicans, he will have support. But obviously, he's going to have a ton of criticism from conservative Republicans, as you can imagine. So in some ways, the politics is different because you have this weird split of the Democratic Party, but in some ways, the same. So the Republicans decide to nominate a guy by the name of Barry Goldwater. Somebody, again, who probably most people, I guess, probably haven't heard of, but I think is really important in our history. He's a very conservative Republican. He was a senator from Arizona. And by the way, when I say conservative, today he'd be considered pretty regular Republican. The Republican Party has become more conservative since then. And that's actually kind of the interesting parts of this election. Because for the most part, Republicans, especially running for president, tended to be more moderate. I mean, certainly Republicans, but more moderate, like Eisenhower, somebody who wouldn't necessarily be against a lot of the programs of the New Deal, but wouldn't love them, wouldn't want to expand them, certainly. It maybe wants to make the government a little bit smaller, maybe a little bit more tax cuts, but not really conservative, as like we'll see with Goldwater. And so the first thing to understand about this is that we had this really interesting election where the Republicans, quite frankly, it's kind of a surprise to a lot of people that Goldwater is the nominee. So he represents the more conservative wing of the party. And I like this quote of his, Barry Goldwater, because he's often accused of being an extremist. You're too extreme in your policies, and we'll talk about them in a second. But I like this quote because he didn't apologize for it. And whether you agree with him or not, you got to appreciate that. He says, extremism in the defense of liberty is no vice. There's nothing wrong. Fine, call me extreme, but I care about personal liberty. And that, for me, is most important. So I want to get the government the heck out of our personal lives. Very typical conservative approach. So he says, look, for example, we're going to reduce the size of government. All these programs that you're creating, Johnson, and all these programs from Truman and especially from FDR, we got to start paring those things down. He talks about the income tax, which has been relatively recent in our history. He said, we got to get rid of this. This is the government just taking your income. They shouldn't do that. You want to have taxes, tax on sales tax, do tariffs. Federal government shouldn't be taxing us. And that, even today, that would be a pretty, I won't say extreme, but a very strong position. So he really wants to kind of dismantle big chunks of the New Deal. Because remember, our government had grown in size, doing a lot more stuff than it ever did before. And it's just expanding under Johnson. And so what he said was his objective is not so much to pass laws, but to repeal them. He's like, we're doing too much. We got to cut back. So I guess technically I pass a law to make the government smaller. And for those that, if you follow any politics at all, I mean, that is very much kind of a conservative understanding today. And that's why, many reasons, he's so important. And I like this is one of his slogans. This is from a campaign button. Because the idea was, like, people would say, well, oh, Goldwater, he's crazy. But, people would say, just listen to him. In your heart, he's right. It might seem like he's a little out there, but this guy makes sense. And that's what Republicans are trying to explain. That's what he's trying to explain. Yeah, we've been doing it this way for decades. starting with the New Deal, expanding government. And yeah, I'm going to be a shock to your system because I'm saying let's make it smaller. Let's have the government do less stuff. You know, I'm right. Now, his extremism was probably more pronounced in foreign policy, which I know we haven't really talked about too much. We'll get to it. But remember, at this point in time, we are really at the height of the Cold War. You guys read about the Cuban Missile Crisis, building of the Berlin Wall, the Bay of Pigs invasion, especially that Berlin missile or the Cuban Missile Crisis. Right, that was almost World War III. That was just like a year prior to this. And so that's really on the minds of a lot of American people is the Cold War. And Goldwater was seen as very militaristic. That's what I mean by hawkish, meaning much more likely to say, you know what, let's just bomb them. Let's not stand, we're not going to stand down. We're not going to back down to the Soviets or anything that they're doing. He talks about massive bombing in Vietnam. We'll talk about Vietnam later. And also, in a lot of his comments, he seemed much more willing to use nuclear weapons. Again, I'm not suggesting that he was saying, let's start nuking people. He wasn't like that. But in his comments, he seemed much more likely to use them than others. And so some people were petrified by this. As we can see here, the Democrats released their own button. So in your guts, you know he's nuts. And so you can see that as part of the campaign is they really started to try to paint Goldwater as really this extremist and sometimes kind of crazy, which is unfair because he definitely wasn't crazy. So what I want to show you guys now is a campaign ad. It's a very famous campaign ad. This is in favor of Johnson, as you'll see. This actually aired, the story is it only aired on television once because it was seen to be as too shocking and extreme for TV audiences back in 1964. Pretty tame by our standards today. But I want you to watch it. It's called the Daisy Girl ad, as you can see. Watch it and kind of gives you an understanding of what this election, this campaign was really all about.
One, two, three, 4, 5, 7, 6, 8, 9, 10, 9, 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, 0.
These are the stakes. To make a world in which all of God's children can live, or to go into the dark. We must either love each other, or we must die.
Vote for President Johnson on November 3rd. The stakes are too high for you to stay home.
So, yeah, so vote for Goldwater and we're going to nuke little 6-year-old or however old that girl was. So like I said, that was kind of seen as too shocking. But again, that's how they painted Goldwater. And well, it worked, as you can see by the map here. Now, important to point out, Goldwater never thought he was going to win this election. He really didn't. He was right. As you'll notice, he wins his home state. But he also, interestingly, wins the South here. Notice this is a major change. For the first time, we see Republicans winning the southern states. Because a lot of those southern Democrats who hated the Civil Rights Act either voted for Goldwater or didn't vote at all. So you're starting to see this change that we still see today where now Republicans dominate the South. And this is the moment that changes. And the other thing, Goldwater, as I mentioned, he didn't think he was going to win. But what he really wanted to do was communicate his message, to tell people, look, Republicans should really be more conservative. We should stop moderating. We should be pushing to dismantle the New Deal. We should be pushing for a smaller government. And a lot of, especially younger Republicans at the time, are absolutely going to pick up that mantle. And then, 16 years later, we have the election of Ronald Reagan, a conservative Republican, who does make some pretty major changes to our system. You can really owe that back all the way to Barry Goldwater. And so that's why I think this election was so important, even if it's really, it's obviously one of the biggest landslide elections in our history. But it's going to have kind of reverberating effects, that we still feel today. So, all right, guys. So thank you on this one. So again, we're going to stop this, and then we'll come back, and we'll start to finish things up as we look at some of Johnson's domestic policies right after the election of '64.